Hello. Thank you very much for joining us at this press conference of the UN Working Group on Arbitrary Detention. My name is Levon Sevuns, and I'll be the moderator of this press conference. Allow me to present the three members of the group of independent experts. Matthew Gillett of New Zealand is the chair and rapporteur. Ganna Yudkivska of Ukraine is the vice chair on communications. And Priya Gopalan of Malaysia is the vice chair on follow-up. Before we begin, we would like to acknowledge that we are in the unceded, unsurrendered territory of the Anishinaabe Algonquin Nation, whose presence here reaches back to time immemorial. We recognize the Algonquins as the customary keepers and defenders of the Ottawa River watershed and its tributaries. We honor their long history of welcoming many nations to this beautiful territory and uphold and uplift the voice and values of our host nation, Miigwech. We will begin this press conference with a brief introduction of the preliminary findings by the three experts, and then we'll open up the floor to questions. Each journalist will get a chance to ask a question and a follow-up. For the benefit of the guests, please introduce yourself and your media outlet. Bonjour, merci beaucoup de vous rejoindre à nous à cette conférence de presse du groupe du travail des Nations Unies sur la détention arbitraire. Je m'appelle Levon Sevuns et je serai le modérateur de cette conférence de presse. Permettez-moi de vous présenter les trois membres du groupe d'experts indépendants. Matthew Gillett de Nouvelle-Zélande est le président rapporteur. Ganna Yudkivska d'Ukraine est la vice-présidente chargée des communications et Priya Gopalan est la vice-présidente chargée du suivi. Avant de commencer, nous voudrions souligner que nous nous trouvons sur le territoire non cédé et non abandonné de la nation algonquin-anishinaabe, dont la présence ici remonte à des temps immémoriaux. Nous reconnaissons les Algonquins comme les gardiens et les défenseurs coutumiers du bassin versant de la rivière Ottawa et de ses affluents. Nous honorons leur longue tradition d'histoire, d'accueil de nombreuses nations sur ce magnifique territoire, et nous défendons la voix et les valeurs de notre nation hôte, Miigwech. Nous commencerons cette conférence de presse par une brève présentation de leurs conclusions préliminaires par les trois experts, puis nous passerons aux questions. Nous commencerons par les questions des gens en ligne. Chaque journaliste aura la possibilité de poser une question et un suivi. Pour le bénéfice de nos invités, nous vous demandons de vous présenter et d'indiquer le nom de votre média. Merci beaucoup.
Many thanks, and thanks to everybody who is attending today. As mentioned, my name is Dr. Matthew Gillett, and I'll say a few words about our experience here in Canada, and then my colleagues Ganna and Priya will add additional observations. At the outset, we thank the Government of Canada for the invitation to come here. We consider the topic of arbitrary detention to be extremely important. It is strictly prohibited under international law because it is wrong in and of itself, and also because it can be a gateway to further abuses, including torture, sexual violence, discrimination, and in the worst cases, even death. From our visit, we were able to attend and meet people at facilities in Ontario, Alberta, British Columbia, and Quebec. We met officials at both federal and provincial levels from a wide variety of agencies and wings of government. We also met with civil society organizations who provided valuable information. And critically, we were able to attend 17 detention facilities, including men's and women's penitentiaries, migration detention centers, youth centers, and mental health facilities. We confidentially interviewed over 100 persons deprived of their liberty, and so we're able to obtain a holistic view of how the systems are functioning and in some respects not functioning in relation to arbitrary detention. We will provide a summary of some of the key issues we discerned, but our complete preliminary findings are set out in detail in the document which has been released at the start of this press conference. And these written preliminary findings will form the basis for a full report that we'll submit to the United Nations Human Rights Council in September 2025. We should note that the working group came to Canada approximately 20 years ago in 2005, and this is our second visit. That experience enabled us to reflect by comparison and see where there were developments, and in some respects, unfortunately, where progress or not enough progress had been made. In terms of good practices and positive developments that we learned of, we would highlight at first that arrest procedures appear to be followed in most instances correctly. Excessive use of force by arresting officers is relatively rare, and while these are broadly positive trends, we would emphasize that any abuse of detainees' rights should be swiftly redressed, particularly during that critical time of arrest and immediate detention. Regarding incarceration, we commend the use of the principle of restraint by Canadian authorities and the Canadian judiciary, which requires sentencing judges to consider a graduated list of non-carceral options and only use detention as a last resort. This has contributed to overall reductions in the numbers of incarcerated people. It applies extensively in youth justice and includes a range of sentencing options, as well as pretrial options, diversionary options, including referrals to community programs, probation, and, in the last resort, detention. We learned of the impact, particularly in youth justice in Ontario, where they've seen an 87% reduction in youth custody admissions since 2004 up to 2022. At the same time, we reiterate calls from the Committee on the Rights of the Child that no person under 18 years of age should be sentenced as an adult, irrespective of the gravity of the offense that they have been convicted for. So with those positive developments, I'll pass to my colleague, Ganna. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Briefly about our main findings. Canada boasts strong human rights protection, particularly under Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, and a robust judiciary that enforces the rule of law. Nonetheless, the working group notes that shortcomings in the implementation of this regulatory framework continue to risk arbitrary detention occurring in a range of circumstances, particularly in relation to Indigenous peoples, groups facing racial discrimination, and other marginalized groups, including persons detained in migration centers, mental health facilities, and with substance abuse conditions. Internationally, the working group recognizes Canada's adoption of the Declaration on the Right of Indigenous Peoples and urges ratification of the optional protocol to the UN Convention Against Torture and Other Cruel and Inhuman and Degrading Treatment or Punishment, and the International Convention on the Protection of the Right of All Migrants, Workers, and Members of their Family. I come now to the criminal justice overview. When it comes to arrest and bail procedures, the working group notes that arrest procedures generally respect legal standard, with reasons for arrest typically explained and rights communicated to the arrestees. The use of force by police is uncommon. Detainees usually appear before a judge within 24 hours, reducing arbitrary detention risks. Bail processes, however, are plagued by inefficiencies, often imposing challenging bail conditions, especially on vulnerable individuals, leading to frequent breaches and unnecessary criminalization of otherwise non-criminal behavior. The working group commends the judiciary's efforts to adjust bail conditions for individuals and call for further reforms to address the inequalities in the bail system. Speaking about legal assistance, access to legal counsel is immediate and typically via telephone post-arrest, with provisions for needy detainees to receive free legal services. Challenges remain in the consistency of lawyer accessibility and effectiveness, with some detainees struggling to maintain contact with their counsel. The group stresses the importance of suspending interrogations once a detainee declares his or her right to silence, especially as physical lawyer presence during police interrogation is not mandatory. Speaking about plea bargaining, the plea bargaining system resolving over 90% of cases present ethical concerns, particularly about unrepresented accused being allowed to enter guilty pleas, and the prosecutorial strategy of introducing multiple, sometimes excessive charges to gain leverage in plea negotiations. This tactic places undue pressure on the accused, disrupting the balance of power in favor of the prosecution. The lengthy delays associated with trials also often push accused individuals towards plea bargains to avoid prolonged pre-trial detention, opting for a quicker resolution. The group concludes that more rigorous regulations and transparency in plea bargaining practices are required. Speaking about rehabilitation and reintegration, efforts to rehabilitate and reintegrate offenders into society are crucial, yet challenged by systemic issues, especially the support of parolees, people on parole, who often lack community ties due to displacement, geographical displacement. The Justice Center model and indigenous courts offer promising framework for holistic community-based approaches to reduce recidivism, necessitating adequate and consistent funding. More generally, enhanced support across housing, healthcare, education, and employment is crucial for successful reintegration. Concerning detention conditions. Conditions in detention vary, with some progressive practices observed in minimum security settings and in efforts to rehabilitate offenders through work programs and virtual family connections. However, overcrowding is common in provincial jails, with inadequate separation of remand and sentenced prisoners and insufficient activities. Conditions in some men's prisons are particularly grim, with frequent violence and gang activity pressuring detainees into undesirable affiliations or plea deals to escape harsh environments. Women's facilities lack proper differentiation for prisoners with various risk profiles and psychosocial disabilities. Extended periods of cell confinement are widespread, exacerbated by staff shortages and resulting in prolonged deprivation of outdoor access. Collective lockdowns for the actions of individual prisoners lead to long periods without prisoners being afforded their usual time outside their cells, often causing also severe intra-detainees violence. The transition from solitary confinement to structured intervention unit, SIUs, has not fully alleviated concerns about detainees' isolation and observance of international standards in this respect. The group calls for urgent reforms to address unhygienic conditions and to ensure the mental and physical well-being of all detainees, especially the vulnerable ones. I finish here and I pass the floor to my colleague Priya.
One of the areas my colleagues and I looked at was the detention of people at risk. One group of peoples at risk are the indigenous peoples, and the overrepresentation of indigenous peoples in the criminal justice system, in criminal justice detention, in particular women, was a matter raised by the working group in our 2005 report. During this visit, we received recent data that reflects this trend of overrepresentation. We heard that 32% of detainees in federal custody and 50% of all incarcerated women are members of the indigenous peoples community, when they represent approximately 5% of Canada's adult population. We were told that these disproportionately high rates of indigenous peoples' representation in criminal justice detention was linked to systemic racism reflected in over-policing, over-prosecution, and over-incarceration. We were also informed of other factors related to intergenerational trauma and the legacies of racism. And these factors included higher rates of poverty, substance abuse, unemployment, homelessness, family and community breakdown. We are aware that authorities must ensure the protection of the public against violent crimes. However, it should also take into account these root contributing factors when formulating responses to the overrepresentation of indigenous peoples in the criminal justice system. We were referred to the case of R.V. Gladue, a 1999 case of the Supreme Court that required judges to consider the background circumstances of indigenous offenders prior to sentencing because of this issue of indigenous overrepresentation. The court in that instance said this issue of overrepresentation reflected a crisis in Canada's criminal justice system. We heard about social history reports or Gladue reports, which give judges information on the lives of indigenous people before the sentencing process. We learned that there have been difficulties in the proper application of these Gladue principles, and the criteria set out in the Gladue principles was sometimes misused. Another concern that was raised with us was the issue of re-traumatization as a consequence of this Gladue report, or being involved in the production of such a report. We received information that participating in this process was akin to telling someone you don't know over the phone the worst experiences of your life. So that was one of the limitations we heard in relation to the Gladue report process and how that links to re-traumatization. During our fact-finding, we spoke to numerous Indigenous detainees who shared personal histories of physical abuse, childhood neglect, mental health issues, all of which led to their involvement in the criminal justice system from a young age. And this long history of repeated incarceration meant that some of them were ill-equipped to cope with life outside detention. And one of the emphases the working group has placed is on the importance of increasing chances of successful release and reducing recidivism. To this end, Section 81 and 84 of the Corrections and Conditional Release Act provides certain opportunities. It allows for Indigenous persons, people sentenced to federal custody, to serve part of their sentences in the communities or apply for release to an indigenous community. We received very positive feedback about this process, about its restorative value, the benefits received from participating in cultural practices and programs that these facilities offered. But we were struck by the limited number of beds available. And we understand that there is a nationwide shortage for these sort of establishments, which are called healing lodges, and that indeed they are lacking in certain parts of the country. And it therefore follows that one of our recommendations was to encourage much greater use of these community-managed healing lodges, and that adequate funding should be provided for these purposes. While we heard about the government's Indigenous justice policy, we would also urge the government to implement the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's call for action and justice, and also to implement the recommendations made by the Office of the Correctional Investigator on this matter. Another issue that we considered was the systemic discrimination contributing to disproportionate incarceration of people of African descent. We received information about recent developments, including Canada's Black Justice Strategy, about community partnerships, and the implementation of rehabilitation programs, all aimed at reducing the disproportionate incarceration of peoples of African descent and other people facing racial discrimination. We were also alerted to ongoing concerns about impunity for police violence and racial profiling, thereby contributing to this issue, which is over-incarceration of these communities. During our fact-finding, we observed disproportionate numbers of detainees of African descent in the highest security settings. This was also an issue that we noted in relation to Indigenous detainees as well. Coming back to individuals of African descent, we also received information about the differential treatment they face in detention, whether higher instances of special confinement and the use of force, differential treatment during the legal process, and how this can then lead to discriminatory outcomes. And therefore, we emphasize the importance of establishing an effective and independent police oversight mechanism. To round off, I would add that the working group also looked into detention in the context of healthcare, as well as substance use and treatment. Thank you.
Thank you. And during our 2005 country visit, the working group noted the problem of immigration detention. And we've seen that 20 years on, there has been a reduction in frequency, but unfortunately significant numbers of migrants and asylum seekers continue to be detained. And we should remember that these people have not been charged with any crime. We heard that 90% of these detainees are not actually considered to pose public security threats. And despite that, they're still detained in conditions which in some instances respected prisons with restricted access to open air and a lack of activities. We were particularly alarmed to learn that Canada allows children and youths to be held in immigration holding centres. Now, this may be motivated by family reunification reasons, but nonetheless, all efforts must be made to avoid such an outcome. And Canada should explicitly prohibit any immigration-related detention of persons under 18 years of age. Immigration detention is run by the CBSA, And some detainees in this context are held for months or even years. We call on Canada to specify a maximum period for this form of detention and to establish an independent mechanism with oversight over the CBSA in order to review incidents of detention on the basis of immigration status. We note that immigration detainees are sometimes held in provincial facilities, provincial penitentiaries, even when they've not been charged with any crime. And whilst we welcome the news that the Memoranda of Understanding between the provinces and the federal government are bringing this practice to an end, we're concerned to hear that the federal government is considering using federal penitentiaries for this purpose instead. So this is a summary of the key findings that we've reached during this 2-week country visit in Canada. We thank the various interlocutors we've met with, from the authorities, from civil society, and in detention facilities. Their contributions have been essential to enable us to form these views. Over the next year, we will be formulating our full country visit report, but we call on Canada to commence reforms in all of the respects that we highlight immediately without delay. And on that basis, we can open for any questions you may have. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I am now directing to journalists who are joining us online. If you have questions for the members of the panel, please raise a hand and we'll go to your question.
We have one in the room.
We'll start with a question in the room.
Hi, Dave Ellis, CBC News. I was wondering that if you had to give Canada an overall grade, what would that grade be?
We don't customarily give grades, but what we will say is that it is a mixed picture where there are positive practices and in some respects impressive trends in terms of the reduction of overall numbers of detainees, but acute concerns in specific areas. And I think my colleagues have highlighted particular groups, Indigenous persons, persons of African descent, and others such as in immigration holding centers, amongst the various groups that we highlight in our written report.
And a supplementary, given Canada's history on these practices, are you optimistic that positive change is in the future, or do you feel that we have plateaued in our commitment to these issues?
I'll say a word about immigration related, and then maybe my colleagues will have a word to say.
Yes.
I think in relation to immigration related detention, we have seen a decline in the numbers being held in this type of context. So I think there is space and a basis for cautious optimism. At the same time, it's guarded because of these indications that there may be a move to putting these people into federal penitentiaries, which would not be a positive move in any respect. And please.
I'll say a few words about the detention of Indigenous peoples, peoples of African descent, and other groups facing racial discrimination. I think what we can observe is that there have been positive steps in this direction, with certain strategies put in place, certain specific programs being made available in carceral facilities for individuals of Indigenous descent, for example. As I mentioned in my briefing, there are particular avenues that enable release or the ability to serve sentences in the community. So there are certainly some efforts underway, and there's certainly a foundation in terms of the strategies or thinking behind this approach. And it's very much underlined by a restorative justice approach, which is rooted in cultural sensitivity. And I think that basis is there. What we then need to move on to is better implementation of this basis. And how would that happen? Issues of funding are really significant. In many ways, the Section 81 lodges that I mentioned, Section 84 releases, those opportunities for restorative justice are in the books. What is missing? What is missing is necessary funding. What is missing is a willingness to allow or enable these opportunities to be made more widely available. So that would be one aspect, I would say. And the second would be to really implement relevant recommendations that are already in place. There are new strategies that are upcoming, and we will wait to see in terms of where and how they are implemented. But in answer to your question, there's already a rich platform or basis for action that can be taken. And if there's one thing I would say would be to implement the recommendations that have already been made by the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, for example, and also the recommendations that have been made by the Office of the Correctional Investigator. And indeed, the recommendations relating to Indigenous people go back 50 years from when the office was established. And I think that is the gap that we would really want to see filled.
Just to add one word, your second question very much relates to your first question. It's not possible to have the same scale for all countries because all countries are different in terms of history, in terms of legacy. And we do recognize the challenges Canada faces precisely because of what you mentioned, and I will not repeat, the colleagues perfectly explain what we have seen and what we do expect. Yes, you have very strong judiciary, you have wonderful initiatives. What is lacking, as Priya just underlined, implementation, sufficient funding, and that gives us really a ground for, as Matthew said, very cautious but optimism.
Thank you.
We have a question in our chat from Alex Boyd of Toronto Star.
I see the question is on underage migrants in detention, and we are gathering the data, sorting through it. The numbers that we're seeing are not in the thousands or tens of thousands, but they're not insignificant. It's not a vanishingly small number, and we will be reflecting and providing more detail in our full report. What is of concern is that it's an ongoing issue, and that the facilities that we have seen and we have personally visited are in some instances prison-like. They're not places for young people to be held, and to have further disruption to their education, to their well-being, both physical and psychological, imposed on them, and in some instances to be placed with people who may or may not present security threats, albeit the vast majority of people being held in these facilities reportedly are not security threats. Some of them may be, which is inappropriate to be alongside someone under 18 years of age.
A question from Dylan Robertson, the Canadian Press. Dylan, go ahead, please.
Hi, thanks for taking our questions. I noticed at the end of your report, you mentioned the CPSA lacking an oversight mechanism. And I don't think that this is new to Canadians. I think it's actually the only law enforcement agency in Canada that doesn't have an oversight mechanism. Can you just articulate why it's an issue if our border guards and the people who are overseeing people in immigration detention, which seems to be expanding if we indeed are moving people out of provincial jails into that system, why is that an issue?
It's an issue of great concern because it introduces the space for arbitrary detention. It introduces the space for discrimination. It introduces the space for abuse of power. because the decisions of CBSA officials have considerable discretion in them. They actually have a lot more discretion than, for instance, a court, whether a court at trial phase or a sentencing phase, where there are those other checks and balances on power. And so that is why we see it as essential that there is a form of independent oversight and review. The people who come before CBSA often are coming from extremely fraught circumstances. They may be escaping very serious armed conflict, persecution in troubled areas around the world, and to then fall into a cycle of incarceration will result in further traumatization. So whilst we certainly hope that CBSA officials are conducting their jobs professionally and with the right ethical values, if there is no oversight mechanism, it simply increases the risk of mistakes and potentially even abuses occurring.
Dylan, do you have a follow-up question?
I might just follow up if no one else is asking a question here. Just the implication on Canada's ability to follow international rules and international norms. If we have that sort of an arrangement where we have a law enforcement agency that's interacting with some of our most vulnerable people in Canada, and we don't have the bare minimum here in terms of oversight, what does that actually mean for Canada's ability to uphold the rules and the norms that it's supposed to?
As my colleague, and please, they will step in at any moment, Ganna has observed, I mean, Canada is a country that has resources comparatively. It has the ability to follow international law, and in many respects it does closely follow international law, and we commented on a number of those. And so in criminal justice there is this pattern that we learned of, where arrest procedure and bringing a person before a judge within 24 hours appears to be the standard practice, both as required under law and on the streets. This is why, for us, there's such a contrast with the area of immigration and a lack of that second level of review, which it doesn't undermine Canada's ability. Canada could strictly adhere to international law, but what it does is it risks Canada coming into violation of international law in practice.
And if I may, one of the benefits, I would say, of having external experts like ourselves conduct these country visits is that we are able to all have an overview of the different systems in place, the different practices, and highlight what works and what doesn't work and what the gaps are. And although, as the person asking the question mentioned initially, that this issue of lack of oversight was already a matter that was well known in Canada, I believe having external reinforcement of these views and linking those to international standards really help to highlight what is lacking and what the gaps are. But equally, we also note that there are many areas that we look at and therefore are able to provide a nuanced assessment of the extent to which any particular country is abiding by international law.
One additional note in relation to the immigration context is that the decisions are often based on classified confidential materials that the subjects of the decisions may not have access to, and we heard in plenty of instances don't have access to. And of course that undermines their ability to effectively challenge those decisions because they don't know their contents. And so this is an area where there may well be valid reasons in instances that security information can't be provided, but without a check and balance of an additional level of oversight, again, it opens the gate to abuse. And that's why we call strongly for the establishment of an independent oversight mechanism with powers to review the actions and decisions of CBSA.
And if I may add on that, in another issue that we have documented in relation to immigration detention is the lack of legislation that sets out a maximum period of detention. And that is also a significant gap in this area. And meeting individuals who are in detention, who are in detention, it was a question or an issue that came up repeatedly along the lines of, I haven't done anything wrong, I don't understand why I'm here, and I don't know when I'm going to leave. Do you know how long they can keep me here? And unfortunately, the answer I had to give was no, because of the lack of legislation limiting the maximum period of detention in the immigration context.
Going back to the room, are there any more questions from the room?
Again, sorry, Dave Ellis from CBC News. I'm interested in the treatment of Aboriginals in our judicial system. And if we had to look, aside from implementing the recommendations that we've seen so far, is there anything else that you can think of that would, A, hasten the implementation of those recommendations? Or is it a case of money and allocated funds to train people? I'm just curious, what do you see as the quickest way to solve the Aboriginal problem in the system?
Thank you for asking that question. And it's interesting to have the word quick in a question in relation to an issue that has really been long-standing and so entwined in many ways with the history of this country. I think Canada has done an excellent job and it has taken a progressive approach in terms of acknowledging these issues, in terms of acknowledging systemic issues, systemic discrimination, in terms of acknowledging the links between racist past colonial policies that have affected these particular communities. And I think there's been a lot of move around uncovering the racist and a colonial basis for the state that this population finds themselves in now. The many reports from the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, the 60 Scoop, the residential school situation, all that understanding, all that discussion, I think has given a very rich basis to understand where and why this population finds themselves in this place. So I will put that there as a very positive basis. What can we do to hasten the process, though? You've mentioned money, and I think that is significant, and colleagues have already mentioned that Canada is a wealthy country, and therefore some of the issues that I noticed in terms of, for example, the lack of beds in a healing lodge, and these are simple facilities we visited too. They are not mega, detainee complexes. They, at least the two we saw, were small structures, in a small part at the outskirts of a town. And you do wonder why more investment hasn't gone into these processes. So I think that's one aspect to it. Second, I think, is to really get a hold or understand the root causes that are leading to over-incarceration. And those are, of course, linked to socio-economic issues, whether it's homelessness or substance abuse. Those sort of factors need to be addressed as well to deal with the issue at root cause. For young Indigenous people, can we give them access to proper schooling? What can we do to ensure that they don't have the first contact with the criminal justice system, which in the interviews that we saw seems to be the start of a process that traps them within the criminal justice system. So 2 points I've made. One is, continue to acknowledge the past. 2 is to address the social socioeconomic factors that give rise to criminality or contact with the law. And the third point I would make is to really embed, consult, and work with these communities, and make sure that those who are willing to work have the opportunity to participate. One of the processes we heard about was the elder reviews within correctional facilities, where elders from the community work with individual detainees of indigenous descent. But apparently they're not sufficient elders, or they're not able to give access, they're not sufficient material in terms of the spirit bundles for smudging processes. So I think another area would be the third aspect, which is to really work with the communities and understand the cultural implications that these processes have, and really treat community members as experts. And the final point I would make, and this was something that came up quite a few times with indigenous detainees that we spoke to, which was, please ensure that when contact is had with the system, for example, when you go in for the first time and you're remanded in custody, I heard repeatedly that we're just released to the street and we don't really have anything. Perhaps our money was taken in prison, and we don't have a choice but to return to our old communities where the issues that gave rise to our offending might be there. It could be substance abuse, it could be gang-related violence. And if we wanted to start a new life elsewhere, we had no money to do so, and therefore had to return to reoffending. So it's not a short answer, because I don't think we can hasten the process, but I think it reflects the nuance and complexity of this issue. And what is needed is a multifaceted approach that addresses all of these concerns that I've raised, with indigenous communities in the heart of it and directing the process.
Supplementary, considering, as you said, that Canada is a wealthy nation, then is it safe to assume that the reason this change hasn't happened is because of lack of political will, in the sense that governments don't see a return in perhaps votes, et cetera, in addressing these problems?
I would see it as much more complex issue, because when the problem is so deeply, when it is systemic problems or covering the whole system, of course you expect resistance from the system. However brilliant initiatives you have on the parliamentary level, on the judiciary level, when it comes, so to say, down to the system shows resistance, which is to be addressed, as Priya brilliantly demonstrated, in a very globally. For example, when the Supreme Court issued this Gladio judgment, which we refer to, actually we refer to a number of very important judgments by the Supreme Court. But what happened afterwards to the Gladio report, it turned around from what was initially invested into this judgment. So what it turned to be is not definitely something the Supreme judges initially wanted it to become. And the same goes with any legislative initiative. So they are wonderful, but they are not enough, and gradually the system changes. So you started speaking about quick changes. Systemic issues you cannot change quickly. So more and more initiatives are required, and also a reaction of how those initiatives are implemented in a way that they're not turning, against the initial goal. And therefore I fully echo what Priya said about this global approach, addressing at different levels what is going on. But so far we have seen so many positive changes and so many willingness from the part of the different state authorities to address the issue as soon as possible, and we really hope it will take place.
Yes,
To say on your question about political will, I think if you view any country and visit any country, you'll see people in criminal justice are not big vote getters in general, and that's across many categories of people. And people also overlapping with mental health issues, with substance abuse issues, all these groups that are at risk. And of course, the government has a duty and a human rights duty to uphold the security of its citizens. And if there are violent crimes and people do present threats to society, of course, detention will have to be used in the most extreme circumstances. But I think what we're referring to is this constellation of problems that come together to do with housing, employment, socioeconomic conditions, which are difficult to address, complex problems. But we did see initiatives, and one example that we mentioned is in Ontario, the Justice Centre model, which does have a strong focus on younger offenders, and there are some Justice Centre models that are directed towards Indigenous populations. And there they are taking, according to what we heard, holistic approaches. So they first try to avoid detention, which is very important, as Priya mentioned, to try and cut off that pathway to a cycle of recidivism, and instead divert a person into potentially productive, active life in the community. And they do that by having a plan, a holistic plan for the person before them, which looks at housing, employment, educational opportunities, and other socioeconomic factors. So we do see there is potential there, but again, it's expanding those kinds of programs. And whilst that may require increased investment of resources and funds, it can actually save considerable amounts of money in the long term, because housing a detainee for a year in any federal or provincial penitentiary is extremely costly. So this is a way in the long run of actually saving public resources.
And a follow-up on that, Matthew has given a very concrete example, and I think the question or this series of questions started off basically with the spirit of, well, we have had this problem for so long, how come it's still a problem to the extent that it is? What is missing? And we've given a range of answers to that and the complexity of it. And we've also mentioned that there have been systems in place, legislation in place, processes in place. So what's missing if all these steps have been taken and the reality is as it is? And I think the gap there is better application of these laws, a better understanding of what it means, and an acknowledgement that that bias is an issue, that many decisions can be biased, and that is not a criticism of the system in some ways. It is the nature of making decisions that bias can be inherent. But what needs to be done is to be aware of it and to take steps towards correcting those biases, whether within the system that maybe channels certain groups one way, or on the part of the decision maker who needs to be made aware that there might be certain biases that affect your ability to make an objective decision. And there are steps that can be taken, for example, taking decisions relating to a security assessment of an individual as a group, as opposed to allowing one parole officer to decide the security assessment of a person. And we know that in the cases of Indigenous populations or Black offenders, they tend to be classified at higher security risks. It may be that they fall within that category, but there's also data indicating that bias within the system, once you are determined to be a high security risk, it's difficult for you to escape that label. So one aspect that I would really highlight is to be aware of bias in decision making and bias in process. I think Canada has already identified that by saying there is systemic bias, but I think there's opportunity to drill down on that issue, looking at particular areas of decision making and how bias might then result in negative outcome for these disadvantaged populations.
We don't have any more questions online, and I think we have reached the end of this press conference. If there are any concluding remarks, please go ahead.
To conclude, we'd extend our thanks to the various members of the authorities, civil society, and particularly persons in detention that shared information with us. And we call on the authorities to implement change rapidly, and at the same time we are open to consultation and constructive engagement over the next 12 months as we prepare our full country report. So, and thank you very much for the questions.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for
Thank you.
attending today.
And I would also like to particularly thank those individuals that we spoke to who gave us such moving testimony of their life experiences and their time in detention, which has really enriched the way in which we have been able to present our findings. Those voices, those experiences really guide us in terms of suggesting reforms, and we very much hope in terms of finding better solutions for those who need it. Thank you.
There was no question in French.